Hello and welcome, everyone. Good evening. This is Granite State Gallery, which is presented by New Hampshire Humanities on the Go, our partner today, as well as Jane ONeail, who is with us, joining us today to tell us more about New Hampshire artists. If you haven't heard of Saint-Gaudens Memorial before, we are the philanthropic partner of Saint-Gaudens National Historical Park in Cornish, New Hampshire. It's the only national park in New Hampshire, and it's the National Park for the Arts, one of only two national park sites in the park system, which is celebrating its 110th birthday today. So happy birthday, National Park Service. But there's only two sites that are the former home of an artist. I guess with that, I'm really just going to pass it to you, Jane, to give your presentation. And thank you again for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. My name is Jane ONeail. I'm an independent art historian and I own the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. I've been presenting this program through New Hampshire Humanities for several years now. It's been such a pleasure. The program has been shaped by New Hampshire citizens. I've gotten so much feedback and information and insight from people all over the state that every time I give the program, it just gets better because of people like you tonight. So please, at the Q&A at the end, please don't hold back. I'd love to hear from you and get your insight. And so without any further ado, we're going to dive into art that has been made here and artists that have lived here, artists that have traveled through. The goal of tonight is really breadth, not depth. I want to share with you as much of the art making that has occurred in New Hampshire as possible. So let's dive in really quickly. A quick preamble for you. I was born and raised in New Hampshire, but I had no sense in terms of the art making history that existed here until I was maybe a college student. I remember coming back to New Hampshire one summer, interning at the Courier Museum of Art, getting a sort of a broader understanding. And then later on, when I was executive director of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, that's an image that we're looking at here, an image from the annual Craftsman's Fair, having a much deeper appreciation for the incredible history of art making that has taken place in New Hampshire. I mean, when I first started off as an art history undergrad, I thought all great paintings were made in Paris and New York. And tonight we're going to go far beyond that. So let me give you a sense in terms of how I've organized the presentation tonight. Like I said, there's going to be a lot. We're going to move pretty quickly through this, but our longest section is our section on tourists to get us started. People who have traveled to the state to make art and have been inspired by this place. Then we'll turn our attention to transplants, which of course includes Augustus Saint-Gaudens. We have just two true Granite Staters we're going to talk about tonight, and then touch on the art that is being made in New Hampshire today. We can't go on without at least one image of the old man on the mountains. So we've checked the box with this image here. This is created by Frank Henry Shapley in 1887. These were really popular images that were being made around the time that sort of give the old man that like halo of clouds. And of course, he's been for such a long time, such an important tourist attraction. So let's turn our attention fully to tourists, because then, as it was today, tourists vastly outnumber us as citizens, right? So we're going to get started with some of the earliest art making in the state of New Hampshire. And what we are looking at here are two painted signs. On the left, a sign from Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and on the right, a sign from Plainfield, New Hampshire. We see the front and back of that sign. The lettering on each of these signs suggests that it was probably made by the same artist, but we don't even have the artist's name. But we can see that this was an artist who probably didn't get formal trading. These were signs that were made in the early 1800s. This artist was nomadic, probably moved about the state where the opportunities presented themselves. And this artist probably never set foot in a museum. So they were probably kind of using intuition for how to proceed. But signs like these I find so fascinating because they functioned like the golden arches do today. These were ways to draw in travelers and tell them that this was a safe place to rest and to fill your belly. So in the Plainfield sign in particular over here on the right, we can see the great cornucopia on one side, and then over on the other side, a nice little landscape with the Masonic symbols included there too, because this particular tavern also served as a Masonic meeting lodge. So we go from this idea of artists just moving around to where the opportunities presented themselves to this next artist whose name we do know. The name is Zedekiah Belknap. And after I give you a little bit of sort of a trained focused look at the way he painted, you'll be able to spot his work from 1,000 pieces. Now, we know that Belknap attended Dartmouth College, got a degree in divinity, and then began to move all around New England, creating portrait paintings like we see here. Now, these were portraits that were done of children in New Hampshire from very prominent families. On the left, we have a painting of Sarah Minot Melville, and on the right, we have Kirk Dearborn Pierce from the Pierce political family. So really only the wealthiest of New Hampshire citizens at the time could afford to pay for a painted portrait of their children. And like I said, Belknap's style is pretty recognizable. My eye always goes to this sort of hard line that he uses in painting these noses in profile. We've got the children seated in or positioned in a three-quarter profile position, sort of like the Mona Lisa, but we get that shadow, that hard line on the nose. We've got all of the wonderful details of the lace and the cuff and the curls for Sarah Minot Melville, but Kirk Dearborn Pierce over here just is so charming. I love the little lace collar, and then how Belknap roughed in this really thick black outline for the line to describe the little boy's arm. It functions as both an outline and a shadow. It's a great example of sort of early American folk art here, and so we get a sense in terms of what the sort of pre-professional artists were doing of the day. But this next artist that I wanted to share with you, certainly a major artist from the 19th century in America, and really one of our first artist celebrities to travel to New Hampshire. His name was Thomas Cole. He was the founder, the leader of the Hudson River School of Painting. It was a sort of a philosophical approach to painting, more so than a brick and mortar school. We'll talk about the elements of Hudson River School painting in just a moment, but it focused not just on that particular region in New York. It was a philosophical approach that could sort of be applied to any landscape. And in this case, in 1827, Thomas Cole was invited up to New Hampshire, or directed really to go up to New Hampshire to the White Mountains to paint the landscape there, and for a particular reason that we'll get into in just a second. So this is his view of the White Mountains. It's in the collection of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. So let me just break down for you a rough formula that Thomas Cole and his contemporaries were using to make a great landscape painting at the time. There was almost always a tall framing device like this tree that we see here in the foreground, and then a little figure or an animal almost painted in miniature to give us a sense of this wild disparity in terms of the height of the trees and the reality of a figure on the ground. So it gives us a sense of scale. We oftentimes see a meandering waterway in the middle ground that takes our eyes back to these vertiginous mountains that are painted with atmospheric perspective. So they oftentimes appear sort of in a blue haze or like a slight lavender haze. So again, now we get a sense of both scale and perspective here. One last really important element to a Hudson River School painting is a blasted tree. We sort of get two of them here. A blasted tree is a tree that's been struck by lightning, and that is a way to remind us as viewers that the American landscape is sort of the wilderness primeval and a little bit dangerous, like anything could happen at any time, but also it's a reminder of the presence of God and bigger forces at play. Now, why was this artist who was associated with the state of New York coming up to New Hampshire. Well, he was sent here because of a horrible disaster that had captured the fascination of the nation. That disaster was the Wiley family disaster. Some people pronounce it the Willie family, but you might be familiar with this. There's a park site there that describes the history of the site near Crawford Notch. But essentially, this Captain Willie and his wife and children, I believe they had 7 children and 2 hired men, they were in their home during a major storm, and they anticipated that there could be a landslide and that their lives were in danger. They took their Bible out, they prayed about it, and ultimately decided to flee for their home to seek shelter in like a bunker on their property. We can see them in this illustration all running towards that bunker. Now, the storm passed, their friends and neighbors came out to find them. The Wileys had all perished. They disappeared. They were gone. But the house remained untouched with the Bible still on the table. It was such a horrific tragedy that, like I said, the entire nation was captivated by it. And it jump-started the tourism industry here in New Hampshire. So that is why Thomas Cole and many other Hudson River School painters started traveling up to New Hampshire. Thomas Cole, again, based in New York, would do these summer hiking trips up to New Hampshire, and he would mostly do sketching. He wasn't painting on site per se. These are some of his drawings that are in the collection of the Princeton Art Gallery, and we can see the kinds of notations that he was making so that he could return to his studio and make a finished oil painting in response. And some of those oil paintings are considered, some of the country's greatest treasures. This work that we're looking at here, called A View of the Mountain Pass at Crawford's Notch, that dates to 1839, is in the collection of the National Gallery of Art. It's another Thomas Cole painting, so you might be looking for that formula already. We've got our tall framing device, we've got our tiny little figure here, maybe a blasted tree on this side. Let me tell you, the fall colors back then even really wowed people. But now we have the drama of a storm. And the idea here is whether or not this little rider is going to make it to this distant house before this terrific storm blows in. And trust me, before Netflix existed, this was high drama. This is what people love to see. And just to give you a sense in terms of what this view looks like today, we can see that we don't have quite that same majestic peak that Thomas Cole had painted nearly, 200 years ago. So I wanted to stay with the Hudson River School painters just for a moment, because so many of them traveled to New Hampshire and were inspired by the New Hampshire landscape. If you've been to the Courier, you probably recognize this painting by Jasper Cropsey. It's called Indian Summer Morning in the White Mountains, painted in 1857. Again, we've got the gorgeous fall foliage, which people would just oohed and awed over when it was painted and exhibited later in England. We've got our blasted tree right here in the foreground. We've got our tall framing device. We even have a set of 2 deer over here, which give us that awesome sense of scale. Like that's not just a rock, that's a giant boulder. If you have really good eyes, there's even 2 more deer over here. Our sleepy little waterway, our vertiginous mountain in the back. Now, in this case, this is sort of a composite image. It's not a specific spot in the White Mountains, but it definitely gives us the feeling of the White Mountains when we look at it. A sort of second generation Hudson River School painter was the German-born Albert Bierstadt, and he painted mountains that oftentimes look like the Alps, but he painted on a grandiose scale. This is his painting of New Hampshire's Emerald Pool. It's a 6x10 painting that's in the Chrysler Museum down in Norfolk, Virginia. And you could sort of isolate little sections of this painting, and they could stand as an extraordinary landscape in and of themselves. But we can see the waterfall here. We can see the vertiginous, hazy blue mountain in the background. But there is so much sort of well-described landscape throughout here. And then the tiny tiny little deer over here on the left to give us that sense of wonder and awe, that sense of scale. Bierstadt was such a showman. He would bring these giant paintings that were inspired by distant landscapes back to New York City. He would charge admission to go into his studio and see them. People would bring their opera glasses and ooh and ah over every square inch of what we were looking at. So there's a whole lot of tourism there, and it didn't end just with the Hudson River School landscape painters. One of the greatest artists of the 19th century in America was the artist Winslow Homer. He is so closely connected with the Maine landscape in particular, but he did spend a little bit of time in the White Mountains and made some work in response to what he saw. I love this image that we're looking at here because we can sort of see what it was like to be an artist in the 1860s and to try and work on the edge of a mountain here. The artists have carried up their backpacks, their spindly little easels, their umbrellas, and they are working, even though the sky looks pretty darn threatening here. There's really only one very thin slice of blue sky there. But Homer gives us just a little clue that it's not all hard work for them. Look over here on the left. We've got a wine bottle that is waiting for them when they are done. Might make getting down the mountain a little bit more perilous, though. I also want to include for you an illustration that Winslow Homer did related to this particular picture. I just find it very humorous because if you know Winslow Homer, he was a little bit of a recluse and turned into kind of like a hermit at the end of his life. And the idea that he could ever be painting and, you know, a lovely woman would be hanging over his shoulder, so concerned with what he was doing. I don't know if he would have loved that or hated that. Winslow Homer did one more painting about the White Mountains. This image is in the collection of the Clark Art Institute out in Western Massachusetts. This is also from 1868, and it's called The Bridle Path. And this picture is actually about New Hampshire's tourism industry. The idea here is that the bridle path is a path where you would lead horses, where tourists could come and see more of the mountains. And I think what's really interesting here is that Homer is not really playing up the mountains. That's just like a distant patch of gray here. Instead, it's about the muddled color on the horse itself, how that sort of blends with these beautiful rocks in the foreground. And I have to say, my heart always goes out to this female rider here. I know a lot of people feel comfortable doing side saddle, but here she is on the side of a mountain. And I think she's even been separated from her group. If you look back here, there are people like waving a flag to her. So it might be tourism, but it doesn't quite feel safe yet. Now, we all know that people don't just come to New Hampshire for the White Mountains. We also have what, about 13 miles of seacoast too. And the leading practitioner of American Impressionism, that is the artist Childe Hassam, spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, actually 30 summers, at the Isles of Shoals, technically on the Maine side, but we're going to bring him into the fold for this presentation. These are two of his American Impressionist paintings from the Isles of Shoals, particularly from when he was staying with the author Celia Thaxter, who had this famous garden on that island. And I love these two images. I should mention that the image on the left is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the image on the right is from the National Gallery of Art. I always like to ask people to, you know, if you were a curator, which one of these would you prefer? Which one would you want for your institution? But I think in both of these, we see that fully developed American Impressionist style, the loose, rapidly executed brushwork, where the artist is not trying to blend the paint or to create an illusion. It's so effective here, I think, particularly in the image on the left, because it makes you feel like you're sitting in this garden among these kind of wind-whipped poppies here. Now, Childe Hassam actually went inland a little bit too. He did some traveling around Portsmouth and Newfields, New Hampshire. And here we can see this beautiful watercolor. I believe this is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This one is inspired by the gorgeous federal architecture that is in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And clearly Hassam was taken by it. I love all of the detail work here that he's done related to the shadows of these trees in the foreground and how they're kind of playing off that architecture. A kind of funny postscript to this particular painting is that Hassam added in this church steeple in the background, even though there is no church steeple there. He just had a good intuition of what like a small New England town should have. It just seemed just picturesque enough. Hassam also created images, well, industrial landscapes while he was in Portsmouth. These are from the 19 teens or thereabouts. These are etchings that are in the Yale University Art Gallery. This is the Portsmouth Athenaeum, which is right in their main square in Portsmouth. I highly recommend a tour of that building if you've never been on it. And then these are just warehouses that were right along the river there. I'm sure they are like $1 million condos now, but this also marks a transition for us going into the 20th century. Now we have tourists that are here who aren't just coming for the natural beauty. There's something more at play here. And that's going to lead us to our next artist who's using a different medium, and they're working further inland in Manchester, New Hampshire. The artist now is the photographer and sociologist Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine wanted a social purpose for his photography and tried to document the poor throughout his career in order to advance the cause of fighting poverty. He was hired by the National Child Labor Board in the early part of the 20th century to go up and down the eastern seaboard and to document as many instances of child labor as he could. So, for better or for worse, he came to Manchester, New Hampshire to see what was happening in the Amoskeag mills. And we get this great image. It's like quitting time at the end of the day. All of these mill workers sort of trudging up through this archway, heading home. And we have this child, a kid who looks about 10 years old, who's still filled with energy at the end of the day, sprinting towards us. One of the most endearing images created by Lewis Hine from his time in Manchester is this one here. It's from 1909. And we can see a little boy that the photographer identified as being an employee of Amoskeag Manufacturing, standing closest to us. And it's this kind of unguarded moment where he's smiling, but I love the expressions of skepticism on the faces of the children behind him, who also seem like they're probably not in the same kind of socioeconomic class. They might not be also employees of Amoskeag Manufacturing. So Lewis Hine would try to get as much information out of these children as possible. So we do know that this is Fred Normandin, that he had been working for Amoskeag Manufacturing for several months. I was giving this presentation once and somebody said, oh, I know, I did research on Fred Normandin. I know what happened to him. And I said, oh, please share. And they said he stopped showing up for work after a couple of months. And I guess that's what happens when you hire a 10-year-old, right? So this was very dangerous work that Lewis Hine was doing. He could have been beaten up, he could have been killed if like the people who owned these mills were on to what he was doing. I mean, he was really trying to eliminate their cheap labor. And remarkably, Lewis Hine got into the mills in Manchester and took this photograph of child employees while he was there. It is a stunning photograph, is it not? Doesn't it look like it should be the cover of Vanity Fair? Look at the confidence on these little boys with their arms crossed over their chests. I love the symmetry of these girls in the smocks and the way that they stand at the center here. As a mother of 3 children, I think it's rather remarkable that all of these kids are posed with their eyes open and willing to be photographed. It's an incredible image from the historical perspective and from our perspective today. Now, we are moving on, and we are going to now sort of critique modern society with maybe what is one of the most important works of art in the state. We've got another tourist who was, in this case, invited to visit and to make art. This is, of course, the mural at Dartmouth College created by the world-famous Mexican muralist Jose Clemente Orozco. So, like I said, he was invited to Dartmouth. He created 24 panels over more than 3,000 square feet of wall space paintings in the basement of Baker Library. This is a social realist fresco. It is highly critical of modern society. Some of these images can be really challenging and I think difficult for some of us to understand still today. But essentially, the artist was aiming to critique modern industrial society and modern academia. So over here on the right, we can see professors in their regalia that appear to be like skeletons, and they're giving birth to a stillborn fetus over here. So that is a very pointed criticism at modern academia, and even more amazing that it was done in the basement of the library at Dartmouth. These paintings are now a National Historic Landmark, but they were not always positively received. Shortly after this mural was executed, a group called the Boston Mothers actually wrote to the university, and they said, quote, "We would be everlastingly grateful if the pictures could be destroyed." Imagine that. We're so lucky that they were not. Now, the next artist I wanted to share with you that was invited to New Hampshire is the artist Charles Sheeler, an American painter who sort of made a name for himself as a painter of industrial landscapes. He'd done a lot of work for Ford Manufacturing. And in 1948, the board of the Currier Museum of Art invited him to Manchester to spend about 2 weeks and make a finished oil painting in response to what he saw. So he painted those same mill buildings that Lewis Hine had been documenting decades earlier. And what's sort of striking about this final work from Sheeler that we're looking at here, called the Amoskeag Canal, is how quiet and how serene this looks, right? There's no sign of activity. There's certainly no child labor here. The mills by this point had been shut down for more than a decade, and in fact were, covered with vines. There were like trees growing out of chimneys. But Sheeler gives us this kind of timeless view of it. It's painted in this precisionist style. We don't see the brushwork. Instead, we almost get like a little bit of geometric abstraction, especially right here at the center. And I love that he made it timeless because, of course, these mills have come back to life and are filled with all sorts of modern industry too. We've got one last tourist for you. And like I said, this is our longest section. Our last tourist is the artist Justin Kimball. He's a professor at Amherst College, and he did a series in the early 2000s where he traveled around New England and he documented natural spaces like we see here. This is Deep Hole, New Hampshire, which is in Gilsum. And it is apparently a very famous and popular swimming spot. So if you have good eyes, you might be able to see that there's something like a dozen people waiting in line to commune with nature here and jump off of that rock into Deep Hole. And essentially what Justin Kimball's project was really all about was this idea that these natural spaces that we love so much, especially here in New Hampshire, that they are slowly changing over time because we love them so much and because tourism is there and is impacting and slowly changing these spaces too. So everything comes full circle, coming back to critiquing tourism, right? What we're going to do now is turn our attention to some of the great transplants, the artists that came to visit and decided to stay. We are going to get started with the artist Edmund Tarbell. And like Childe Hassam, Edmund Tarbell was a great practitioner of American Impressionism. He made some of the most beautiful paintings at the Currier, including Summer Breeze here from 1904. I love all of these shades of blue that we see here in the woman with the romantic veil billowing out behind her. Now, Edmund Tarbell was a leading artist in Boston, but he had a big family and he was sort of willing to get away from it all. He purchased a house in Newcastle, New Hampshire in 1905, moved there permanently with his big family. They built onto the house right on the water, really picturesque. And from that point on, the artist decided to turn his artistic attention directly to his family. They were his models, they were his inspiration. We've got this other great painting by Tarbell called Mercy Cutting Flowers. This is a depiction of his daughter from 1911. And here she is sort of sitting on the cusp of being a teenager, looking ever so elegant. perched on the edge of this porch, trimming up flowers for this bouquet. We can see that loose impressionist brushwork in the background, but notice the more realistic depiction of her face and hands, which draws our attention to where her focus is and her youthful beauty too. Um, One of the really funny elements of this picture is sharing it on tours at the Courier Museum, because when little kids see this, you know what they all think? That she's playing on her phone. So sad, right? Also kind of funny. But another detail that I've always appreciated here is along the top, that white picket fence in the background, giving us sort of a nod to like an image of the Virgin Mary, it's sort of sequestered away in a garden, and this idea of like protecting your young daughter this way. Here are just a couple more pictures from Edmund Tarbell. They tend to be really quiet. They tend to show people reading books or writing letters or making puzzles. They always remind me of like life during COVID. The image on the left here is called Josephine and Mercy, painted in 1908, again at that house. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And the image on the right is called The Letter, from much later, 1933, and that is at the US State Department. So highly valued works. You might be wondering about that house, though. Edmund Tarbell passed away in 1938, and that huge house was passed on to his children. They subdivided it into apartments later on, and I had a really funny sort of postscript to what happened to the house by way of a former colleague at the Courier Museum. She was a very effective fundraiser, but she was just getting her feet wet with the art world. And she had this aha moment one day when she told me that years prior, probably in the 1980s, she realized that she had actually rented a house in Tarbell, or rented an apartment in Tarbell's old house. She had a photograph of the inside of her apartment, which featured his paintings. And she began to laugh at herself when she realized that as she was being toured through this apartment, presumably by Tarbell's own children, and as she was seeing all of these paintings in the apartment she was about to rent, she kept saying, "Is this John Singer Sargent on the walls?" And they just kept saying, "No, it's Edmund Tarbell." She had no idea who that was and didn't realize it until decades later. Now, a sort of a sad postscript is that this beautiful house actually burned down 10 years ago in a two-alarm fire. But it happened at right around the same time that there was a major exhibition of Tarbell's work in Portsmouth, and a new monograph that was printed at the same time. So luckily, I think most of his artwork was preserved despite that devastating fire. Now we're going to turn our attention to another major important transplant to the state, and that is, of course, Augustus Saint-Gaudens. We can see him here in an image on the left, and his home in Cornish over here on the right. Beginning in 1885, Augustus Saint-Gaudens and his wife began coming up to Cornish, New Hampshire for their summers. They moved here full time in 1891 up until the artist's death in 1907. Many of his best known works were developed or even finished while he was here in New Hampshire. And then, of course, his sort of creative presence here was the center of the Cornish colony, where roughly 100 other artists and creative types were drawn to the Upper Valley every summer because of this sort of creative flair that Saint-Gaudens first brought to the area. So let's turn our attention to some of his work. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, which is on the edge of the Boston Common down in Massachusetts. This is a high relief sculpture that we can see here honoring Black soldiers who served during the Civil War. It is highly realistic in terms of its depiction of these soldiers. As I understand it, Saint-Gaudens worked very carefully with models specifically from New York for this work, but it was a project that he worked on for roughly 14 years, spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, fully realizing the final sculpture. It's a major work. It's the first public monument in the United States that pays homage to the heroism of African American soldiers. So we have that to be so proud of. Another important facet to St. Gaudens' artistic output was his many depictions of Abraham Lincoln. And in the decades following the Civil War, of course, Abraham Lincoln became a real unifying figure following his death, and like I said, separated by a couple of decades. So there was a big demand for images of Lincoln, and St. Gaudens had to walk sort of a fine tightrope in order to create these images because they needed to look lifelike, they needed to look like Abraham Lincoln, but they also needed to be respectful and sort of dignified. And this was a challenge because during his lifetime, Abraham Lincoln sort of universally regarded as a kind of like a funny looking guy. When he came to New Hampshire and spoke to the students from Phillips Exeter Academy, that was their first impression of him. He's strange looking. So these are specific to his appearance, but also honoring him and celebrating him. This particular version of Abraham Lincoln seated and looking so reflective, this is in Grant Park in Chicago. I love how there is a nod here to his abilities as an orator. It's as though he's pausing to reflect before he rises to give an address. And we can see how his toe just sort of pokes out a little bit beyond the edge of the sculpture there, as though he is about to rise. Now, one last St. Gaudens sculpture that I'd like to share with you is this monument here, which was commissioned as a gravestone or grave marker in 1891, just after St. Gaudens had moved to New Hampshire full time. The the gravestone was for a woman who had sadly taken her own life, and St. Gaudens sort of poured through different faith traditions to try to create an image that was beyond just the suffering of this loss. In fact, Henry Adams, who had commissioned the work itself, had kind of directed St. Gaudens to think about the Buddhist concept of nirvana. So he's trying to encapsulate so much here. And we see a little bit of ambiguity with the figure who doesn't necessarily read as male or female, lost or triumphant here. The end result, I think, is something that is deeply moving and also very mysterious, particularly when you see it on a sunny day and you're approaching this shrouded figure and you're not quite sure what you're going to see in that shadow. In the end, this work is generally referred to simply as grief. And as you get closer to it, you can see something that seems to speak to a profound sense of loss, with the eyes turned downward and the face sort of resting at the near the chin there. What we're going to do is transition from grief to ecstasy. Are you ready for this? We've got another transplant. It's Maxfield Parrish, who we see over here on the left. We've got one of his famous Girls on a Rock painting, this one called Ecstasy from 1929. Parrish had relocated to the Upper Valley because of Augustus Saint-Gaudens and the Cornish colony. He was so drawn to the creative spirit that existed here in New Hampshire. And he went on to become really one of the most celebrated illustrators in the golden age of illustration. Without a doubt, his most celebrated work is this one here called Daybreak from 1922. This was an image that he created with the intention of it becoming an art print. Parrish was very smart about how he sold his artwork, and he was essentially selling rights to his work as he was producing it, and talked about selling the rights to his image so that it could be on cards or candy or be an art print, and eventually be able to sell his paintings many times over. This is why he was called a businessman with a brush. What's happening here in Daybreak? We have sort of a vaguely neoclassical setting here with big Doric columns, the figure here clad in a toga who seems to be waking up at the first light of day. There is this nude nymph-like figure who bends over this figure. Maybe this is the very personification of that first light of day or of sunshine. And look at how this young girl sort of greets that figure with this big smile, almost like greeting it like a lover. There is some sensuality to this image. We do see that first light, and Parrish was so great at painting light. We can see it spreading across the edges of this column. And then there's just layer after layer of beauty here. We have a canopy of flowering trees. We have this gorgeous blue still water. We have this unbelievable rock face that's all peach and lavender here with endless nooks and crannies. This is an image that was estimated to be, I think, in one out of every four households in America at one point. Life magazine did a survey of Americans in 1936, asking them who their favorite artist was. And I think the top three answers were Cezanne, okay, Van Gogh, all right, and Maxfield Parrish. That's how popular he was. And this image has incredible staying power. Some of you might still remember the great movie from the 80s, The Princess Bride. Look at how the movie poster is a reference to daybreak here. And then I bet you didn't think you'd hear the name Michael Jackson tonight, but Michael Jackson, when he was married to Lisa Marie Presley, even did a very awkward video paying homage to Maxfield Parrish. Who would have thought, right? So Maxfield Parrish had this beautiful estate, Plainfield, New Hampshire. This is sort of a reproduction of that estate that had burned down. The view from that property is some Vermont mountains. This is Mount Ascutney, and that same mountain range would find its way into a lot of Parrish's paintings. This is a sweet little snowy scene that's in the collection of the New Britain Museum of Art. But Parrish's estate is marked by these enormous oak trees. So it's called the Oaks today. In the background there, you can see an outbuilding, which is practically as big as the main house. That was Parrish's studio and an additional apartment space. When I was giving this presentation via Zoom right around the time of the beginning of the pandemic, I mentioned that the Oaks was for sale. And at the time, I think it was for sale for just under $1 million. And at the end of the Zoom, somebody piped up and they said, I got it for a lot less than that. The person who had just bought the property was on the Zoom. He invited everybody up to see it. You can go see it yourself too, because it's now a Maxfield Parrish Airbnb. You can go and stay on the property if you'd like. Here's just a few more peeks at Maxfield Parrish's work. And this is something to look for when you're out and about in New Hampshire. This is an example of his work, another daybreak image. This one's at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. But notice the way he has illuminated these tree trunks, the side of the barn over here with that first light of day. And it's this special quality of light that Maxfield Parrish was so talented in capturing. And I think right around this time of year too, you see it at dusk as well. So if you're having a late dinner, check out the tree trunks next time you're eating outside. One last thing to keep in mind if you're up in the Upper Valley is to stop by the Plainfield Town Hall, because Maxfield Parrish painted the stage set for the town hall. It has been called the most beautiful stage north of Boston. So we see the scenery here, that's Mount Ascutney again in the background, and all of these beautiful drapes. The original lighting scheme too was I think just like amber, blue, and ruby colors to give the effect of the seasons changing too. So put that on your list if you have not seen that yet. For now, we have two true Granite Staters we're going to consider as we move quickly towards the end of tonight's program. The first of them is John Brooks. John Brooks is a New Hampshire furniture maker. He is his work is represented in museums around the world. world. He was born in Manchester, and he's a member of the New Hampshire Furniture Masters. We get a little bit of a sense of his work, I think, from these two images, especially from the image on the right. It's a chair, of course, but it also looks like it has a life of its own and could just get up and walk right out of the room. So the name of the game with John Brooks is whimsy, right? Magical. And he lives in something that looks like a hobbit house today. He would typically open up his house for public tours in New Boston every year, and you could go and see this whimsical home that he designed from the outside. Like I said, it looks like something from Lord of the Rings. From the inside, unmistakably a woodworker's home. I challenge any of you to want to go up to that little loft up there. Sadly, when John Brooks was preparing for a solo exhibition, a retrospective at the Courier about a decade or so ago, his studio burnt down. But because of that, there are now all of these great sort of backup systems that are in place for emergency relief for artists in this state, which is so wonderful. And he was able to go on and have that retrospective. If we look at some of his earliest works, it's sort of chunkier furniture, like this chair over here on the left. But his more recent work over the past few decades has been based on these more slender forms. And John Brooks, I mean, he literally just walks out of his door into the woods and finds sticks and branches that have shapes that he's sort of responding to. And sometimes he molds them. He usually takes the bark off of them, and then he sometimes molds them into forms that are just so pleasing. Did a whole series of these dogs that he covered with these sort of squiggly lines here, and he would name the dogs after famous artists. I believe this is Christo and Jean-Claude here. Very expressive, very playful, and they seem to defy the very materials that they were made out of. Over here on the right, we have a ladder back chair, which it's fully a sculpture and not a piece of furniture. And again, it's covered with all of these little lines that sort of look like his own personal set of hieroglyphics here. So unexpected colors, familiar forms represented in unexpected ways. If you go to the Courier Museum, you can see this bench here that's called True Love's Blue. The Courier recently changed some policies and they invite people to sit on this bench now. And let me tell you, it's a strange experience to be sort of face to face with one of these little heads here. Our next artist, our true blue Granite Stater here, is the artist James Aponovich, a painter. We can see his self-portrait from 1989 over here on the right, and a more recent photograph of the artist over here on the left. The self-portrait is also in the collection of the Courier Museum, and it's such a rich image to dive into with people of all sort of experience, ranges of experience with art, because everybody sees something that they can sort of name and identify and marvel over with this picture. There's a hyper-realistic bulletin board in the background with references to objects in the Courier's collection, with repetition of forms here. You can always go to like this beautiful arc of this gooseneck lamp here and how it's echoed in the shape of like the bowls and the fruit. So he gives us a lot to dive into, but he's probably best known as a still life painter. And this isn't just photorealistic, this is hyper realistic, because everything is represented with this crystal clarity. And this isn't even the way we see the world. So this is Still Life with Chocolates from 1984. Some familiar elements here: the nautilus shell, the bowls, the pieces of fruit here, the tiger lilies. What's sort of fun for me is being from New Hampshire. I remember, I mean, I must have shopped at the same fabric stores that he did when I was a child with my mother, because I mean, these are the fabrics that were in my home when I was a child. So this seems like a particular New Hampshire image to me. In recent years, James Aponovich has developed this formula that he really likes. He likes a floral still life with a swag of drapery and then a landscape in the background. We have Appledore Island, or daylilies on Appledore, over here on the left. And then I could not resist showing you this Italian-inspired still life over here on the right. Who doesn't love the peonies here and the beautiful view of the Italian landscape? Look very closely at this black vase here. You can see droplets of water and a reflection of the artist himself working on the very canvas that we're looking at. Always fun to discover those sorts of things. In recent years, James Aponovich did a collaboration with the New Hampshire furniture master, David Lamb. David Lamb did the casework for both of the objects that we see here, and then Aponovich filled in these panels with New Hampshire inspired still lifes that we see here. The culmination of this collaboration, which they called Lamovich, is this object here, which is a stunning buffet, essentially, with this remarkable veneer work that opens up into this almost like panoramic scene of the White Mountains with all of these references to New Hampshire itself. We've got the apples and the lilacs and all of this wondrous detail that is contained within this one piece of furniture. So highly collectible, right? So in our last few moments, we're going to very quickly just touch on what is happening in New Hampshire art today. Just a quick overview. The name of the game here is innovation. And if you're from the Upper Valley, you probably already know Sue Sunny Park, a professor at Dartmouth College, who specializes in these very social media friendly installations with industrial materials that seem to defy gravity. We are looking at her installation at Rice University from about 10 years ago. It's called Unwoven Light. And as we get closer, we can see that we are looking at industrial chain link fencing that has been molded into these ethereal forms with all of these tiny iridescent tiles that have been strung in the negative space between that chain link fencing. The end result is something that feels otherworldly and yet still kind of familiar. It's absolutely mesmerizing. You are drawn towards it. You want to understand it. You want to experience it. Here's just another quick view of Sue Sunny Park's work. This installation is called Vapor Slide. And again, it's created with this chain link fencing. And in this case, it just has plastic cups that are pushed through the chain link fencing and then simply rocks that are hanging down from the fencing tied by string. You look like you feel like you've entered into a space where there is wild weather happening. It seems dangerous, it seems seductive, and then it sort of confounds you in the fact that it's made out of these rather simple and familiar materials that she has completely transformed. The next artist I'd like to introduce you to is Kathleen Dustin. She is a juried member of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen. And oftentimes when we think of the League, we think of like wood turning and more traditional art forms. She's juried in polymer clay. And even though the objects that we're looking at here all seem like they're from the natural world, these are things that she molded with her hands. So these aren't really rocks or little pieces of sticks or seed buds. These are forms that she created clearly inspired by the natural world. They're also very surprisingly light. She has work in museum collections around the world. She teaches around the world, but she still lives here in New Hampshire. These purses, I think, in particular, are sort of collector's items. She told me once that she did a whole series of purses for somebody's wedding. Instead of giving their bridesmaids bouquets of flowers that would just die, each one got their custom Kathleen Dustin purse, which just sort of pops open about halfway down. I love the rock with the apple on it. It looks so hyper realistic, but again, it's just made of polymer clay. She regularly showcases her work, presents her work at the Smithsonian Crafts Fair. And a couple of years ago, none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to her booth and bought one of her necklaces, which I know was a high point in her career. We are going to move from one political figure to another, leaving DC, coming back to New Hampshire. This is former Governor Chris Sununu, and he is standing alongside Jeremy ONeail, who is actually my husband. Jeremy specializes in high-end silicone masks. He does monsters, but he does a lot of hyper-realistic work like we see over here on the left. So he is sculpting these out of clay, casting them in silicone, painting them, and then sometimes punching in individual hairs. And you might be wondering why. Well, he does this for movies, he does it for theme parks. Occasionally, there's a private investigator that needs to do a stakeout and disguise themselves. Every couple of years, the Indianapolis Colts gets in touch with him for an old man mask that they then put on their professional kicker, and he kind of hobbles out onto center field and then does like a perfect field goal kick. So let me tell you, there's never a dull moment living with this artist. But we will wrap up with one more artist who's from the Manchester area, and that is Vivian Beer. She's an industrial furniture designer. We can see her here on one of her works on the left, and another example of her designs over on the right. She has worked, again, in museum collections around the world. This particular red chair, though, again, the form is seductive. I don't know if I would trust it with my weight, though. In recent years, Vivian Beer was invited to create a piece of furniture or an object, really, in response to something in the collection of the Currier Museum. And she came up with this, which in contrast to like all of the antique sort of early American wooden furniture there, this stands out. It's called Anchored Candy number 8. This is automotive red candy apple paint here. It's shiny, it's sexy, it sort of looks like a high-heeled shoe. In the end, it was actually the early American collection that inspired it. This chest on chest here, that little sexy leg of the dresser here is what inspired the form that Vivian Beer created. And again, these days you can go to the Currier and sit on it. The last I checked, it was in the lobby and they were welcoming people to experience it themselves. Not too long ago, Vivian Beer actually won an Ellen DeGeneres design competition, a reality show, and $100,000. So I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more interesting work from Vivian Beer. For now, we are going to do just a very quick wrap up. What we have seen. We've seen New Hampshire artists that have not just explored the New Hampshire landscape, they have used traditional and boundary breaking art practices, creating landscapes that stir the soul. They have examined familiar subjects through the years in a variety of media, and they have captured the expressive potential of the human form. So I always say, it's not Paris, it's not New York, but New Hampshire has an art making tradition that is second to none, and it's one that we should all be so proud of. Thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. If you have any questions for me, I think we're an intimate group. We could probably have a conversation if you'd like, or you could use the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Jane. It was really, really, it was interesting because a lot of these pieces I have experienced over the years and I catch, oh, that's New Hampshire. Oh, that's. But one that I saw tonight, which I hadn't expected, was a member of our board actually, which is Sunny Park. So I was like, oh,
Yeah.
hey, I know that one too. But thank you. If there are questions, yes, we do have the Q&A open. Otherwise, you can also email us or and I can send them to you, Jane.
Sure.
So I will allow for just one more minute to see if anyone has any questions. But otherwise, yes, thank you so very much. This was
My
fantastic.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hmm. Since there are no other questions, I am going to end this webinar. But again, thank you, and we will hopefully see you at the park soon. Oh, wait. We do have a question. We got to thank you. We have thank you.
Oh, this is my friend Fran. Fran, thanks for being on tonight, for joining us. It's always nice to see your name.
Thank you so much. Bye now.
All right. Good night.